Welcome to the third episode of Reverence for Rêverie. I'm your host, Marrissa, and I'm so excited for what we have planned today. This podcast is a space where we explore the big questions about life, consciousness, spirituality, and the threads connecting science to what's often seen as the mystical. Today, we're starting with one of the most fundamental questions. What is consciousness? As a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I've spent years exploring the depths of the mind, from what we're aware of to what lies just outside of our awareness, shaping our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Consciousness is often thought of as that which we can clearly perceive. For example, I'm aware that I'm speaking to you right now. You're aware that you're listening to this. Maybe you're also aware that you're driving, or you have awareness of what is next on your to-do list. But as we know, and will continue to explore throughout this podcast, the mind is far more vast than what we can easily access. From psychoanalysis to ancient mystery schools, countless traditions have pointed to a hidden realm that shapes our everyday experiences. Psychoanalysts might call it the unconscious, while esoteric teachers or our indigenous elders refer to it as spirit or the great mystery. Even ancient philosophers recognized forces beneath the surface of our awareness. Whatever the name, the idea is the same. We're influenced by deeper currents of thought and feeling through our dreams, patterns, and desires in ways we rarely notice. This raises a fascinating question. If so much of who we are lies beyond our direct perception, how do we even begin to define consciousness? From a scientific perspective, neuroscience tells us that consciousness arises from brain activity, neurons firing in complex patterns, generating our thoughts, perceptions, and sense of self. But even with all of our advances in imaging and research, science still can't fully explain the experience of consciousness, the vivid, subjective feeling of being you. Think about it. How exactly do electrical and chemical signals in the brain create that sensation of I am? In other words, what I'm referring to as that subjective feeling of being you. And why is it possible to observe our own thoughts if those thoughts are just themselves neural firings? It's one thing to identify where certain thoughts occur in the brain, but another to explain the very act of witnessing them. That leads us to a deeper question. If we're both thinking and observing our thoughts, who or what is doing the observing? This is often called the hard problem of consciousness, and it's one that science and philosophy are still grappling with. And then there's this strange idea from quantum physics that takes things a step further. Let's talk about the famous double slit experiment, one of the most mind-bending discoveries in physics. So here's the setup. Scientists wanted to see how light, or particles of light, behave when they were passed through two slits onto a screen. If you fire tiny particles like electrons through the slits, you'd expect them to create two lines on the screen, matching the two slits, right? Simple enough. But here's where it gets weird. When scientists weren't watching the experiment, the particles didn't behave like particles at all. Instead, they created an interference pattern, a series of lines on the screen as if the particles were actually behaving like waves, spreading out and interacting with each other. So far, so strange. But when scientists placed a detector to observe which slit the particles passed through, something unbelievable happened. The particles suddenly stopped acting like waves and behaved like solid particles again, creating only two lines on the screen. Please go look this up online if you'd like to understand it more. It really is fascinating. But what does all of this mean? The conclusion that they came to was this: the act of observing changed the behavior of the particles. Let me say that again. The mere presence of an observer altered reality itself. This experiment raises profound questions. Does consciousness itself, or our act of observing, shape reality? If at the quantum level matter behaves differently when observed, what does that say about the role of awareness in creating our experience? Have I lost you yet? I hope not, because here's where science and spirituality start to intersect. Ancient teachings have long suggested that consciousness isn't just an inner experience. It actually helps shape our reality. For instance, the Hermetic principle from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus tells us, as above, so below. As within, so without. It's that same notion that you see in the Kabbalion, which states, all is mind, the universe is mental, implying that what happens in our minds is directly reflected in the world around us. In the Hindu Upanishads, we find you are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. While Buddhist teachings in the Dhammapada say we are what we think, all that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. And even the Bible echoes it. For example, in Proverbs 23:7, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And then Jesus says in Mark 9:23, all things are possible for one who believes. Different words, similar message. Our inner landscape, our beliefs, intentions, and expectations shapes our outer reality. And it's fascinating to see how modern science, through experiments like the famous double slit experiment, hints at a similar idea. When observers expected to see two lines on the screen, that's exactly what appeared, suggesting that consciousness itself, or at least the act of observation, may play a crucial role in influencing how reality manifests. It's a striking parallel between the spiritual idea that our inner world and the outer world are intimately connected, and the scientific notion that observation impacts what is observed. So maybe consciousness isn't passive, it's participatory. Maybe we're not just watching life unfold. Maybe our awareness is part of what brings it into being. While science continues to grapple with a precise explanation of consciousness, many spiritual traditions propose a different view. Perhaps the brain doesn't create consciousness at all. It merely tunes into it. In other words, your mind might function less like a light bulb that generates its own illumination, and more like a radio that receives signals already present in the airwaves. If that's the case, then consciousness could be something that we tap into, an energy or a field that connects us all, rather than a personal phenomenon sealed away in our heads. Quantum physics, with its intriguing theories about the observer's role, opens a window onto this perspective. While it's still hotly debated how it all works, the core idea remains. Observing a quantum system appears to influence what actually happens. For instance, experiments like the famous double slit demonstration show that particles behave differently when someone is measuring or watching them, as though awareness and intention is not witnessing reality, but somehow it participates in shaping it. Does this sound too out there? Consider that many respected scientists and philosophers are asking the same questions today. If subatomic particles can change their behavior under observation, it suggests that our consciousness plays a far more dynamic role in the universe than simply perceiving it. So maybe the ancient spiritual notion of a universal consciousness, and the modern quantum puzzle aren't as far apart as we might think. It could be that we're all plugged into one vast field of awareness, actively co-creating the reality that we experience. And as I say that, doesn't that sound like what some might refer to as God? But not all cultural and religious traditions have viewed this realm with curiosity or acceptance. In many cases, people have feared these unseen dimensions, labeling them occult or evil. Why? Perhaps because this space operates outside the tangible, measurable world, which can be unsettling to established religious dogmas or power structures. When we talk about tapping into a collective field of intelligence or exploring psychic phenomena, some faiths may have historically condemned it as witchcraft or heresy. Yet if we look deeper, we realize that everyone partakes in this unseen realm, whether it's through dreams, intuition, or the subtle ways we pick up on each other's emotional states. That's where psychoanalysis, from my perspective, offers a bridging perspective, showing us that these so-called mystical processes are actually part of our shared human experience. In my work as a psychoanalyst, I've seen firsthand how our unconscious processes, memories, repressed emotions, and unexamined beliefs can shape our perceptions and behaviors without our realizing it. Freud likened the unconscious to a vast reservoir beneath the surface of a lake, while Jung described it as a repository of archetypes shared by all of humanity. Modern psychoanalysis expands on these ideas with concepts like projection, projective identification, and enactments, showing how we subtly send out or take on emotional material without our conscious awareness. These concepts demonstrate how unconsciously we are always passing feelings, fantasies, and unspoken desires back and forth. Even if a religious tradition labels certain capacities as forbidden or supernatural, psychoanalysis reminds us that every person engages in these energetic and emotional exchanges. It isn't the domain of a select few. It's fundamental to how we operate, physically, mentally, and spiritually as humans. So what happens when we shine a light on these hidden parts of ourselves, when the unconscious becomes conscious? We often discover that once we observe something within us, we can begin to transform it. A knee-jerk reaction that once felt automatic starts to make sense. Long-standing fears begin to lose their grip. It's as though, just like in the quantum realm, the act of observing shifts the dynamics in play. In this sense, psychoanalysis is its own form of inner alchemy, turning our personal lead into gold through the practice of self-awareness. Now, how does all of this connect to Rêverie? Well, that's precisely the heartbeat of this podcast. Rêverie is that invitation to dip into that deeper field of intelligence consciously, rather than letting it remain unexplored or dismissed as taboo. Rêverie is the space of daydream, imagination, and intuitive insight, a gentle drifting that, when harnessed, can reveal potent truths about ourselves and the world we inhabit. In essence, it's a state of openness where boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind become permeable, allowing creativity, wisdom, and even healing to arise naturally. When we approach Rêverie with awareness, we begin to see how our minds aren't isolated islands, but interconnected parts of a vast ocean of thought, feeling, and possibility. This openness is what enables psychics, mediums, or energy workers, like myself, to gain insight into experiences that aren't explicitly theirs. They're simply navigating a shared field of consciousness that's available to all of us if we're willing to pause, listen, and tune in. In other words, they're drawing from the same deeper currents that psychoanalysis refers to when describing how we affect each other through projection and projective identification, only they're doing it in a more overt and focused way. I would argue this is precisely what psychoanalysts are trained to do, at least in part as well. In the realm of relational, intersubjective, and somatic psychoanalysis, the image of the analyst as a tuning fork has gained wide resonance. Wilfred Bion, who I've referenced before, introduced the concept of reverie and container contained, where the analyst's body and mind literally absorb the patient's unprocessed emotions, metabolizing and transforming them before offering insight back to the patient. Building on Bion's work, Thomas Ogden emphasized a deep receptivity, an ability to momentarily inhabit the patient's experience without forfeiting one's own subjectivity, giving rise to what he calls the analytic third, a field, if you will, that is co-created between the patient and the analyst. John L. Stern delved into the idea of unformulated experience, highlighting how the analyst's attuned presence helps give words to sensations and feelings that the patient can't yet articulate. While Jessica Benjamin spoke of thirdness and rhythmic attunement, a non-verbal embodied dance that co-creates a field of shared meaning. Extending these ideas, Beatrice Beebe and Frank Lockman demonstrated how micro moments of attunement, mirroring breath, posture, or tone, signal the body registering unconscious truths. And Philip Bromberg took this further, arguing that the analyst's ability to stand in the spaces between different states of self and other is crucial for genuine therapeutic contact. And the final reference I'll make to this is Siri Erica Golestad, explicitly defining the analyst's body as an instrument of resonance, i.e., the tuning fork example, forever picking up on pre-verbal cues that shape the therapeutic process. In each of these perspectives, the analyst's task is not merely about listening to content, but receiving it, taking it in, feeling it, much like a tuning fork vibrates in response to external sound waves. Unspoken affect, dissociated emotions, and even subtle body shifts become part of the analytic dialogue. The analyst must remain open enough to resonate with the patient, yet grounded enough to process and transform what emerges. It is a deeply embodied stance, a physical, mental, and emotional tuning that helps bring the patient's buried experiences into conscious awareness, ultimately fostering healing, insight, and ideally a profound sense of connection. One of the critical reasons analysts are encouraged, indeed required actually, to undergo their own analysis is to sharpen their ability to differentiate what is theirs from what is the patient's. If an analyst is weighed down by unexamined emotions, biases, or trauma, they risk mixing their own material into the patient's process. Instead of acting as a clear, resonant tuning fork, they may amplify or misinterpret the patient's unconscious signals. Personal psychoanalytic work equips the analyst to better recognize, own, and manage their own reactions, allowing the focus to remain squarely on the patient's needs. The same principle applies to psychics, mediums, and energy workers. While tapping into subtle realms or fields of consciousness can be a powerful gift, it also carries a major responsibility to ensure that what's being perceived is not overly colored by the practitioner's own unresolved issues. Someone who hasn't done the deep work of self-examination risks injecting their personal fears, desires, or fantasies into the messages that they receive or relay. In this way, unprocessed projections can undermine the authenticity and clarity of their insights. That's why working with well-trained, reputable professionals, whether that's an analyst or a psychic, is so crucial. A solid background in self-awareness and ethical practice provides the grounding needed to separate one's own emotional or energetic content from the patient's or client's. This doesn't mean perfection by any means, but it does mean that the practitioner has cultivated an internal framework for noticing when their own stuff shows up and can take steps to keep it from distorting the work at hand. Ultimately, the more a practitioner has explored their own unconscious landscape, the more faithfully they can guide others through theirs. There's a saying that says, "You can only take someone as far as you've gone yourself." The statement is simple, yet it's complex in its truth, and is very important to consider as you engage in your own work. From quantum science and ancient mysticism and modern psychoanalysis, there is a convergent theme. Our consciousness is more expansive than we've been led to believe, and our awareness plays a crucial role in shaping both our inner world and the reality that we experience in our outer world. By recognizing and engaging with this deeper field through analytic work, spiritual practice, or even just those moments of rich, imaginative reverie, we can gain the wisdom, perspective, and creative spark needed to shape a new reality. This isn't as woo-woo as it first appears. Instead, it's an invitation to consider that we are all participating in a vast, interconnected tapestry, one where observing, reflecting, and truly seeing can transform us from the inside out. And it starts by daring to look inward, asking questions, and trusting that the answers that we find in those hidden places can transform us, and by extension, the world around us. So we've talked about consciousness in some ways as though we always know what's going on in our minds. But the truth is, a large portion of our thoughts and beliefs function beneath conscious awareness. Psychoanalysis points to the unconscious, where hidden assumptions, inherited narratives, and unexamined feelings shape our actions and reactions, often without our realizing it. In our last episode on decolonizing the mind, we explored how social and cultural legacies can condition us, embedding ideas that might serve certain power structures more than they serve our well-being. If we don't shine a light on these unconscious influences, we end up perpetuating old patterns, personally and collectively, generation after generation. And this is why doing the deep internal work of bringing the unconscious to consciousness is so crucial. When we start revealing and transforming these unconscious scripts that drive us, we begin to create new possibilities, and not just for ourselves, but for the people who come after us. That's why I see emotional health as the new form of generational wealth. Sure, financial assets can be passed down, but so can unhealed trauma, skewed beliefs about our worth, and toxic relational patterns. By contrast, when we commit to our own healing, we give our children, our communities, and our future generations the gift of freedom from those limiting narratives. I'll expand this idea in future episodes, so be sure to tune in so you don't miss that. Ultimately, learning to observe and reshape our unconscious thought processes empowers us to co-create a new world, leaving a legacy of awareness, compassion, and genuine emotional well-being. It's not just a personal journey, it's a collective one. An essential part of decolonizing the mind and embracing the vast field of intelligence and possibility that reverie, psychoanalysis, and conscious self-reflection invite us to explore. This is what it means to raise your level of consciousness, to expand it, and doing that work has a more profound effect than you might realize. Think of the so-called 100th monkey phenomenon, where a single new behavior, once taken up by enough members of a group, appeared to jump across physical boundaries to influence the same behavior in distant communities. If you've not heard of this before, the simple version is that the 100th monkey phenomenon is a story, though partly mythologized, about a group of monkeys on a remote island who learned to wash sweet potatoes. Once a critical number of them, often symbolically called the 100th monkey, adopted the habit, monkeys on other geographically separate islands began doing the same. While this exact event isn't scientifically confirmed, it's often used as a metaphor for how new ideas or behaviors can spread rapidly through a collective consciousness once enough individuals embrace them. Although the specifics of that story remain debatable, its underlying symbolism rings true. When we each engage in our own inner work, uncovering unconscious beliefs, healing old wounds, and expanding our capacity for imagination, we become part of a broader awakening. Each personal breakthrough adds to a critical mass of collective transformation, rippling out in ways that we can't always see. In other words, every time you raise your level of consciousness, you may be quietly paving the way for others to do the same, helping shift not only your own life's trajectory, but also the shared field of possibility that unites us all. So here's a question for you. When do you feel most conscious, most aware of yourself in the world, most embodied, present? Maybe it's in moments of stillness, like meditation or daydreaming, when you slip into that space of reverie, the very word that is inspiring the name of this podcast. It's in those quiet moments that we sometimes notice the subtle workings of our mind, and perhaps something greater. If you take anything from today's episode, please let it be this. Your consciousness is far more expansive than you realize. Whether through science, psychoanalysis, or spirituality, the journey to explore it is one of the most profound paths that we can take. I'd like you to reflect on this for a moment. What happens when you observe yourself? Take a moment, maybe right after this episode, and experiment with simply watching your thoughts. No judgment, no agenda to fix or change anything. Just notice what drifts through your mind, like clouds passing across the sky. At first, you might feel restless or self-conscious. Thoughts might race, or you might even draw a blank. That's completely normal. What's important is staying with that observation. Give yourself a minute or two in this quiet, curious space. And as you do, maybe ask yourself, what am I becoming aware of that I didn't see before? Perhaps you notice a lingering sense of worry about something you brushed aside earlier, or you catch yourself replaying a scenario from yesterday. Whatever surfaces, just notice it. Why does this matter? Because whether we're talking about the universe at large or our own mental landscapes, awareness itself holds a transformative power. When you tune in and truly see the dynamics at play, your fears, hopes, ingrained habits, you begin to loosen their grip. It's like turning on a light in a dark room. The shadows don't necessarily disappear, but you can finally navigate without stumbling. This experiment is a simple, everyday way to explore the very principle that we've been discussing, that the act of observing can shift what's being observed. When you illuminate aspects of yourself you weren't fully aware of before, you create the space for change. Gradually, the insights gained in these small moments of self-observation can ripple outward, affecting how you respond to stress, handle relationships, and even envision your future. It's a gentle but powerful reminder that consciousness, yours, mine, and the collective, plays an active role in shaping our reality. So as we wrap up this journey into consciousness, how it shapes our reality and how so much of our thinking remains unconscious, I encourage you to keep questioning the stories you've inherited. In our last episode, we looked at decolonizing the mind by shedding limiting beliefs and making space for the new. Today, we expanded on that idea, seeing how reverie, our unguarded, imaginative state, can open doors to deeper intelligence and creativity. When we consciously observe ourselves, when we bring what was previously unconscious into conscious awareness, when we invite intuition and reverie into our lives, we're simultaneously choosing to co-create a new world and leave behind a healthier legacy for ourselves and future generations. I want to thank you for joining me again on Reverence for Rêverie. If today's exploration resonated, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions are surfacing? What questions are surfacing for you around consciousness? And how does this view of awareness and observation change the way you see yourself and the world? Feel free to reach out on Instagram at Reverie_the collective or email us at reveriecollectiveteam@gmail.com. I always appreciate hearing your reflections and your insights. Before I go, I'd like to remind you about the mental health fund I'm creating, focused on making in-depth psychoanalytic psychotherapy more accessible for those who need it most. If this resonates with you, please consider a one-time or recurring contribution through my Buy Me a Coffee page at buymeacoffee.com/Reverie_the collective. That will be linked in the show notes. Your support helps cover the cost of therapy for individuals who otherwise couldn't afford it, bringing transformative care to more people. So until next time, and with the deepest gratitude, stay curious, keep observing, and let the reverie lead you.